Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now, here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Everyone, welcome to this first solo episode of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. Let me talk first about the rationale. Usually, this is a program where I do an interview of someone who is more or less a subject matter expert, and we kick around a particular topic or set of topics in behavior analysis for about an hour, sometimes a little bit longer than that. But I unfortunately had a cancellation, and I've been trying to keep to a schedule of publishing 3 episodes per month. And so in trying to keep with that, I figured I would just collect some thoughts of mine and share them with you, and we'll kind of see how this goes. So if you're a member of the Behavioral Observations Facebook group, you probably already can expect this episode coming. And so I kind of put this quandary out there, should I do a solo episode? If so, what do people want to hear about? And so the idea of school consultation came up a few times, and it is something I spend quite a bit of time doing in my everyday practice. So I thought I would jot down some thoughts about tips for school consultation and share those with you. So I hope you enjoy this, and if this is something you want to see more of, just let me know. But at the same time, I recognize that most people tune in to hear the experts, and I certainly am under no impression that I am God's gift to behavior analysis. So, but anyway, I hope you enjoy this. And so before we do get to that stuff, I do want to let you know that we've got a few things coming up. And the first one I want to talk about is that there's another ACT boot camp for behavior analysis, behavior analysts coming up. And that's going to be on March 7th through 10th in Reno, Nevada. And this will be taught by people like Steve Hayes, Evelyn Gould, Mark Dixon, and David Sloan Wilson. Again, it's a multi-day, I think a 4-day event, and it will provide 32 continuing ed credits. So if that's something you're interested in, hit the show notes for this episode. And we also have a $50 coupon code. So all the information will be in the show notes. So just head over to behavioralobservations.com to check that out. Another thing I am really excited about is that the book that Dr. Lisa Britton and I have been working on over the last year and a half or so is almost coming out. It'll be out sometime in April. We've got the cover art. It is being sent out to select people for their review, and we've been getting some good feedback on it, and I can't wait to share it with you. So you'll be hearing more about that in upcoming episodes, though I promise not to be super obnoxious about promoting it. Well, maybe just a little bit obnoxious, but try not to go over the top, if you will. But it was a really fun project to work on. Lisa was great to work with, and I think it will be something that supervisors will find helpful. So just stay tuned, and we'll be hearing more about that in the upcoming episodes. So let's get on to today's topic. So I have, 11 tips for providing school consultation that I've just kind of jotted down. So I literally just sat on my computer and tapped out some number of bullet points that I thought would be helpful to share. And let me, set the context. The idea here is that with most behavior analysts providing services in either clinic or in-home settings, the idea of doing school consultation is something that I think today's behavior analysts are perhaps doing less and less of, because the market share has swung over to the insurance-funded work that's taking place in clinics and homes and the like. But many folks will be called on to do school consultation. And again, it is something that I do more rather than less. And so I thought I would share some of these tips for those who may be less familiar with these activities. I also want to stress that I don't want to come off from a preachy or soapbox type of perspective here, because a lot of the things that I'm mentioning here will be mistakes that I have personally made and have learned along the way. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to save you from learning these mistakes the hard way, like I did. And then I guess finally, some of the problems that I mentioned here that I see in schools, I don't want to give the impression that these problems are universal, but these are some of the issues that I talk about in these tips for providing consultation. I have seen with some level of frequency, but I don't want to make the case that, I don't want to be like down on schools guy or anything like that. But at the same time, I want to be very realistic about some of the challenges that are present when you're providing services in these settings. So I have great respect for the hard work that people do in schools. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you know that I am not just a school consultant, but I'm married to a teacher. All our friends are teachers. So I come at it from that perspective. So without any further ado, let's get right into this list. All right. So tip number 1 is recognize that, like any organization, schools have distinct cultures. So I guess the general thing I wanted to start off with is that schools are kind of funny places. And again, not to overly generalize here, but I get the sense that teachers kind of make this discrimination of you're either a teacher or you're not, right? So while there are some teachers who are welcoming and open to new ideas, there are going to be some number of teachers who might be skeptical of whatever you have to bring to the table. What do I mean by that? Well, some teachers might have assistance, I guess, thrust upon them. In other words, they might be a struggling teacher and the school is hiring a consultant to come in and help them either improve their classroom management or improve their interactions with a particular student. So you might not... You might have to work harder to kind of be welcome there. And even in circumstances that are perhaps less, I guess, coercive or less, I guess, how should we say it, less constrained in those types of circumstances. I guess at the most general level, teachers may see a behavioral consultant as just one other kind of annoying thing that they have to deal with in their very busy day. One of the things I get a lot when I speak to teachers is that there are so many, at least here in the United States, there are so many initiatives and reforms and things like that. They might look at you as just, and I'm using air quotes here that you can't see, just one more thing. And so you have to, at least from a big picture perspective, recognize that you're not going to just step right into the classroom and start making big changes right away. There's some groundwork that oftentimes has to be done in order for you to be a really effective behavior analyst in school settings. So based on these procedures, how do we proceed? So, I guess my second tip here is to acknowledge your naivete and even play it up. So one of the things I try to do is acknowledge right out of the gate that, hey, you know what? When I'm talking to the teacher, I'll say things like, hey, I've never taught second grade. I have no idea what it's like to hold the attention of that many 7-year-olds. And in doing so, you take yourself out of the kind of know-it-all category, which is very aversive to many teachers. Right? They don't want someone coming in and telling them what to do, especially if you're working with a teacher who's been doing it for, 15, 20, 25 years or so. Right? So you want to come in and talk in a way that, again, acknowledges that that you are not a teacher. You just, again, have to kind of own the fact that, that you are coming in with a different skill set. And as such, again, some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about sounds, more like common sense than anything else, but it's something that I feel that is helpful to underscore nonetheless, is to essentially listen to the teacher more than talk at them, especially in those early stages of developing a relationship with that teacher. And it reminds me of the kind of the whole empathy and compassion discussion that we had in the session that we did about WEBA a few episodes ago. In particular, Bridget Taylor and others go into great detail about it in the paper that was published in Behavior Analysis and Practice, and that is Taylor, LeBlanc, and Nosek, 2018. And I'll have a copy of that paper for the show notes to today's episode. But again, you want to try to connect with that teacher and listen to what their concerns are. And don't go in and start saying, this is the distinction between positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement and yada, yada, yada. You'll lose them right away. I guarantee it. Believe me. I've tried. I've tried that approach and it's been unsuccessful. So I guess tip number 3 is, target the behavior that's most important to that teacher. Unless there's a real imminent safety issue or the child's placement in that classroom is at risk, go after what's most important to the teacher, especially if that's something that you can have a quick win with. So if calling out in class is something that's just really annoying that teacher, but you think, there might be some other problematic behavior that is, more important. But nonetheless, you feel like you can address that calling out, with a simple intervention. Go ahead and knock that one out first, because what you'll essentially do is make a fan of that. That teacher will become a fan of you, essentially, and then you'll be able to move on to some of those things that you feel are more important. So again, just target the behavior that's most important to the teacher, unless there are other circumstances that make doing that not a good idea. Number 4, respect the teacher's time. I hear this from my wife all the time when someone comes in and basically destroys her planning period. There are times of the day where teachers may appear available, whether it's during their planning period, when their students perhaps at a special, if we're talking about elementary level teachers, during lunch, recess, and things like that. And when you approach teachers during these times, very often, oftentimes out of sheer politeness, they'll talk with you if you have questions and you're trying to get a background on a kiddo's situation and things like that. But most likely, if you kind of spring this on them, you're taking them away from other things they had in mind to use with that time, whether it's making copies, grading papers, preparing for the next lesson, the rest, responding to email and phone calls, even eating and God knows using the bathroom. So again, you just really, really want to be respectful of the teacher's time. So if you are wanting to meet with a teacher to, let's say do a functional assessment interview, and again, I know this sounds like common sense, but I see this rule kind of get violated all the time. But identify a time that's mutually convenient to chat, that you're not taking that teacher away from other duties. If you do happen to catch a teacher during these downtimes without scheduling something in advance, again, be upfront and acknowledge. Say something like, hey, I'm probably taking you away from your planning time, and I know that time is valuable. Do you have a few minutes to talk? And if not, I'm totally fine with meeting, during a later date. So just ensure that you're continuously respectful of the teacher's time. All right. Tip number 5. In addition to respecting the teacher's time, respect the teacher's classroom. I have a thing about entering classrooms that, a few rules that I try to adhere to, and they're as follows. Don't enter a classroom in the middle of a lesson. Now, again, that sounds like common sense, but you have no idea how many times that I've arrived to a school to do an observation of a student, and the principal or the case manager or the guidance counselor meets me in the office and says, okay, I'll bring you down to, Mrs. Smith's classroom. They bring me down the hall, and she has the whole group on the carpet doing a math lesson. And they're like, all right, go ahead and go on in. And what I generally do in those circumstances, unless that teacher's expecting me, unless she's already said it's okay for me to come in at that time, I will wait. I'll wait till she's done with that lesson, wait for some sort of appropriate transition, and then go in. It's just kind of a thing I have. But again, I want to be respectful. If you're trying to hold the attention of all those kiddos, and then some adult comes in, and then the kids turn and look, and next thing you know, someone starts engaging in some off-task behavior, you'll not win friends and influence people. Again, it's just a lesson I've learned the hard way. Again, when you're setting up a time to do an observation, get a sense of what the teacher's schedule is. Get a sense if there are any disruptions to that schedule. So, like assemblies and things like that. And then try to find a time to come in the classroom during some sort of naturally occurring transition, so you don't interrupt the instruction in a way that I just described. And again, it's all about trying to really build some rapport with that teacher, so you can work with them. Because at the end of the day, at a certain point in time of the intervention, you're going to ask them to do things differently, and that's going to involve some response efforts. So the less aversive you can be, all the better. Right. So another way you can respect the classroom is select a place to observe from that you're not in the way. I've been in classrooms where, space is quite limited, and had to move around quite a bit as the class has shifted from one activity to the next. So just ensure that you're not in their way. And if you have a class that's moving from center to center, for example, continuously check to make sure you're not in the way. And then one other thing while we're on the topic of observing is supply the teacher with a response to the question, what is he doing here? So you want to make sure that the teacher knows exactly what you'd like them to say. So if you want to remain inconspicuous and you want to minimize any kind of reactivity to your presence, you could just tell the teacher to say, hey, if someone asks what I'm doing here, just tell them I'm here to watch, to observe you teach. Because this, a good part of that's true, of course. And another way of handling that is just have the teacher announce that ahead of time, and it just removes the need for the kids to ask that question in the first place. And with the general idea is that you want to avoid being, for all intents and purposes, outed by the student that you're trying to observe. Again, with the idea of trying to reduce some level of reactivity. Okay, we're on 6 already. Holy cow. Be reasonable with data collection assignments or data collection decisions. And again, one of the things, I guess the theme that I'm trying to communicate here is that we want to avoid being there's that whole notion of the ugly American when they travel overseas. They're, kind of loud and at times perhaps disrespectful of, the local customs, cultures, etc. We want to avoid being the ugly behaviorist. Very often, if you talk to a teacher who's been in the business long enough, very often they've had behavioral consultants in the past, and they might have worked with behavior analysts in the past who have not left the greatest impression. And one of the ways that we leave these impressions that are problematic are, some of the stuff that I talked about already, kind of coming off as kind of a know-it-all, not being respectful of the teacher's setting, and time, etc., but also making unreasonable data collection recommendations or assignments. So when you're considering how to collect data and what types of data to collect and things like that, we want to take those considerations that we know already, that we've learned in school, in terms of the type of data we want to collect. But in the context of consultation in school, you really want to try to collect the least amount of data necessary that you need to make a particular decision. So maybe you can collect data all day long, or maybe it'd be unreasonable to expect the teacher to collect, frequency data all day long. But maybe they can collect it during a 15 or 30-minute span of time where the problematic behavior is most likely to occur. Or maybe there's a particular span of time where there's an extra person in the classroom that can help with data collection. And so, you'd rather collect really, really precise data for a short period of time than really, really crappy data that's ultimately not useful for a longer period of time or throughout the whole day. So again, you really want to just focus on being very efficient with your data collection so you don't stroke out the people whom you're asking to do this work. Another thing that I've found is helpful is when you do graph the data is to show it to the teachers. And again, I know some of these recommendations just sound like, well, duh, Matt, that sounds like common sense. Yes, of course it's common sense, but I have to mention this because I see and hear stories from teachers from time to time. And again, just reflecting on my own history, I've done this when I've been, super busy and not observant of some of these thoughts that I've written down here. Is that you have people collect lots and lots of data, and you don't show them the fruits of their labor. So if I'm graphing something up, I'll show the teachers the graph so they can see what this looks like in the beyond the raw data sheets. Especially if a behavior is trending in the direction we want it to go, we want to share in that, and hopefully that they'll find that to be reinforcing in nature. So. One other thing that I've found helpful when I'm talking to teachers to prepare them to collect data, especially in situations where they don't have a history of doing so, is to basically outline a rationale for collecting the data. And usually I say something like this. I'll say, I'm going to ask you to do things a little bit differently, and those things might be difficult. Or they just might be hard because it's different at first. And the last thing I would want is for you to be doing these new things, these different things with this student, and not knowing whether they're working or not. God forbid we perpetuate an ineffective intervention. We wouldn't want you to work that hard, that long, without knowing what you're doing is making a difference. And that's why we take data before we start the intervention and after. So I usually kind of go into it a little bit like that, like, let me help you by designing some system that's easy to use for you to track whether or not what you're doing is making a difference. And again, in doing this, I really try to echo the sentiments of Pat Fryman, who, is one of the people who really has been a big proponent of using plain language in our discourse with non-behavior analytic personnel. So this is definitely an area where that's necessary. Number 7, realize that schools are not always well-versed with the importance of maintaining privacy. Again, this is just kind of one of those cultural things that I mentioned earlier. If you're used to working in a clinic, where all the information is HIPAA protected and people use initials or client numbers and things like that to refer to individuals, at least for the purposes of communication and things like that. You step into a school and a lot of that stuff goes out the window. So one of the things I've seen from time to time is that schools will contract with a behavior analyst to provide services, and they may or may not gain parental consent for the analyst to do the assessment. It might be brought up in an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting, and it might be referenced in the notes. And for some schools, they consider that good enough in terms of consent to do an assessment or consent to develop a treatment plan, et cetera. We have a higher standard than that as behavior analysts. So you'll want to essentially train the school how you want to work with them. And so there may be some times you'll need to do some education with them. Okay, if I'm going to be involved, I need the parents to specifically consent to my involvement in the case. Once we get a behavior plan together, we're not just going to go ahead and start it. We need to meet with the parents again, review it with them, make sure there's true informed consent, yada, yada, yada. Again, if you haven't worked in these environments, you must be thinking to yourself, well, gosh, this is, again, common sense. But I mention this because I see this stuff all the time. So another aspect of privacy that I see, that the challenge in school settings is that oftentimes folks catch each other in hallways, and we'll start these discussions about student needs and things like that in these areas that are somewhat less than private. And again, you'll need to kind of train the staff how you want to work with them and say, hey, can we take this into, this room here? Is there an empty room we can talk in? I have also seen, this happens all the time, where let's say I'm watching the instruction in a small group special ed setting. Sometimes a paraprofessional or a teacher will say, well, Johnny over here has, and lists off some number of diagnoses. And I'm not there to work with Johnny, mind you, but they'll start talking about this kiddo as if I should know about his challenges and things like that. And so you have to kind of deal with that as well. Excuse me. I find like kind of two ways to deal with that. One is I guess extinction. If I don't respond, sometimes they just stop talking about Johnny, or I'll just say, oh, okay. And regarding target student, and just try to basically do some response interruption, and that usually works. But there have been times when I'll look at someone and say, look, I'm really not permitted to know about this student's information, and so if you can avoid kind of talking about that to preserve his privacy, etc., that would be great. So that you can try either one of those, and your mileage may vary, but those are two ways that I've found to be pretty effective. Let's see. Number 8, I kind of touched on this earlier, but it bears repeating, and it's this. When you're interacting with staff, you want to maintain a level of humility. Again, you don't want to come off as a know-it-all. That is a surefire way to be a turnoff to these folks, and ultimately that does not serve the student. And again, teachers are besieged by all sorts of reforms and so-called innovations, et cetera. So you really just have to be humble with whatever you are asking them to do. My method of doing that is to be, relentlessly self-deprecating. So I'll usually poke fun at myself. And again, I mentioned this earlier, like I've never been a kindergarten teacher. I have no idea what it's like to, run a math center or, do things like that. I have no idea what it's like to hold the attention of a 7th grade social studies class, and just acknowledge that. And in doing so, you're kind of, again, paying some respect to that teacher. It's like, and the struggles that they have. Another kind of self-deprecating thing that I do is to say, hey, it's easy for me to suggest that we try this new way of treating the problematic behavior, because you see, I had this visitor sticker on, and at the end of the day, I get to leave and I'm not going to be here tomorrow. But you need to tell me if this is something doable from your perspective, And so again, you really want to acknowledge that what you're doing or what you're suggesting might be new, might be different, might involve more response effort. And that it's not something that you're just saying, hey, do X, Y, and Z and it'll be super easy, And I guess my last point in this is perhaps not to necessarily overdo it to the point of coming on, you want to come off as competent and confident. So you might need to maybe seek some feedback from some peers to figure out how to strike that balance between, self-deprecation and the confidence piece. So, all right. Number 9, recognize that progress may be slower in schools than in other settings. Why is this the case? Well, it makes sense on a number of levels, I guess. Schools have limits on staff training. There's a whole, I guess, if you're working in a clinic or an in-home setting, chances are that the direct staff you're working with are either RBTs or RBTs in the making, or people who've gone through your company's intake and training process. In schools, oftentimes it's the least trained person works with the most highly, needy students. And getting training to staff is extraordinarily difficult. One of the things I see from time to time is that a student will move in and they'll, have their whole, discrete trial or ABA program that comes with them. They're assigned a para who's never done it before. And the next in-service time that you actually might have an opportunity to sit down and do some training with that staff member is 5 weeks away. Oh, and by the way, they have to have first aid and CPR, and that's going to take priority over, your training with that person. So the reality is that you're likely to have to do a lot of on-the-job training, and so just recognize that. There are limits on managerial tools. So if you have staff members who aren't performing, there are limits. It's difficult for a variety of reasons to do some really effective performance management. For again reasons that probably go way beyond this particular episode. But long story short, staff assignments are not always made for the ideal reasons, and the managerial skills and resources of administrators and case managers and et cetera are limited. And when you think about it, principals go into education as teachers, not as managers, so it once they become administrators, they're now asked to manage. And same thing with case managers. If oftentimes case managers are the ones who are in charge of the paraprofessionals in their classroom. They've been taught to teach, but oftentimes they're not taught how to manage. And so there's opportunities, but there's also challenges. The challenge is there is that it's not going to be. The likelihood of it being a well-oiled machine is perhaps lower than it might be in other settings. It is also an opportunity, however, and to teach a case manager how to do some performance feedback and things like that. There's certainly some improvements that can be made as well. But just recognize that overall the progress can be slower in those settings for those reasons. Number 10, this is right out of our code of ethics, is to make recommendations based off of student needs, not school resources. And I think there's something, and the school piece is not from the code itself, but the general idea is that you don't make recommendations based on whatever the financial restrictions are. You make recommendations based on whatever what you think is in the best interest of the student. So I've had settings I've worked in where people say things like, we only do inclusion, or we don't do one-to-ones, we never use edible reinforcers, and I can go on and on and on of these kind of institutional rules that people tacked. And I'll very nicely nod and listen and say, okay, well, that's nice, but no, I don't say it like that. But, you basically say, well, based on, the available literature, et cetera, and professional judgment, the student's need is X, Y, and Z. And the thing that you have to do is to be able to make those recommendations and let the chips fall where they may. There's been times where, I've seen people lose school contracts by making recommendations that are, clinically appropriate. And you have to be kind of willing to do that for all those reasons. So, and that brings me to tip number 11. and this is the last one, and that is the following. Recognize that, as in all other settings in our lives, not everyone is persuaded by scientific evidence. So we are, right? Of course we are, as the applied science of behavior. We take very seriously what is and isn't evidence-based when we look for intervention procedures. And for one reason or another, the field of education is riddled with all sorts of interventions that have very little, sometimes no, scientific scrutiny to them. And so we need to recognize that, and we need to respond in a way that doesn't alienate us. And so I guess one quick story I have about that I can draw from my own personal experience is that I was consulting to a school once, and I was chatting with the principal, and I was standing kind of like, I don't know, like across his office. I was just kind of standing, leaning against the doorway, and he was sat at his desk. And he said, "Hey, Matt, check this out." And he tosses me, as he's like completing the sentence, a book is flying in the air at me. So he tosses me this book. I somehow managed to catch it. And I look at it, and it's Alfie Kohn's Punished by Rewards, which, if you're not familiar with it, it's kind of a anti-behavioral book that, for one reason or another, has been very popular in educational circles. I looked at the cover, and I basically said, thank you very little, and I kind of tossed it back to the principal, and went on to say that he kind of didn't know what he was talking about, blah 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 blah. And I don't think I wasn't super rude about it, but at the same time, it was probably a missed opportunity. And I think if I handled that situation differently, I might have been invited back the following year to continue consulting in that school district. So again, we need to learn how to work nicely with others. We want to avoid that notion of the ugly behaviorist that I mentioned earlier. Running around saying things that have no scientific support is a great way to get you kicked off a team. It's a great way for you to perhaps unnecessarily lose a contract. And at the end of the day, you can't do that kid any good if you're not there providing services. And that's not to say we tolerate things like facilitated communication and whatnot. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that that in order to, we need to recognize that there are a lot of unfounded things going on in school settings, unfortunately, and for the time being, kind of accept that, and then make people fans of our work by doing good work, and by extension, showing that a scientifically validated approach such as applied behavior analysis is, in short, a good thing for our students. So, I think Matt Broadhead wrote an article about that very thing in Behavior Analysis and Practice. I think it's from 2015. I just found it here. It's Maintaining Professional Relationships in an Interdisciplinary Setting. Strategies for navigating non-behavioral treatment recommendations for individuals with autism. So I'll have the link to that paper in the show notes of today's episode. So there you go. There's 10 tips plus a bonus tip for my random thoughts for working in school settings. I hope you found these helpful. And if you have any thoughts about this, go to behavioralobservations.com and leave a comment on that episode page, or connect with me on social media. And I would love to kind of keep this conversation going. So that's all I have for today. So I will look forward to getting some more interviews under my belt. We've got a lot of great conversations coming up in the month of February and beyond. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, I will see you in the next session of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.